Sometimes the movie comes out and everyone, general audience and critics alike, likes it. It's probably safe to say that most everyone enjoyed The Dark Knight, Lawrence of Arabia, Back to the Future, Jaws, and so on. This video is not about those movies. No, here I want to take a look at the movies that got mixed or negative reviews from critics, but were well liked by audiences. They all made decent money and are the kinds of movies that lead to people saying that critics are out of touch with a general taste. Ruben Fleischer's Venom arrived as a Spider-Man universe spin-off featuring Tom Hardy as Eddie Brock, a journalist who becomes the host for an alien symbiote. Released in 2018 amidst skepticism as to whether or not the movie could work, Venom was Sony's first, and so far most successful attempt at building a cinematic universe around Spider-Man adjacent characters without Spider-Man himself. The movie had a campy tone and focused on the darkly comic relationship between Eddie and Venom. But man, this is one of those movies where the disparity between the critics and audiences is off the chain, with a nearly 50-point gap between the critic and audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. I saw it in theaters and enjoyed it myself. It's a movie that I had wanted ever since the aughts and was excited to see it in theaters. Granted, the sequel, Let There Be Carnage, ended up being a letdown, but this was a fun flick. Critics, however, thought that it was a poorly made film that couldn't decide what kind of movie it wanted to be. Reviewers complained about narrative incoherence, tonal whiplash between the comedy and the violence, and chaotic action sequences. Perhaps they were watching a different movie, but I found it pretty simple to follow. Rotten Tomatoes critical consensus reads, quote, "Venom's first standalone movie turns out to be like the comics character in all the wrong ways. Chaotic, noisy, and in desperate need of a stronger attachment to Spider-Man," end quote. I think that belies the issue with the critics here. They were looking at it in the context of a Spider-Man film as opposed to a film unto itself. For them, it seemingly never had a chance because it was devoid of Spider-Man. Beyond that, they found the corporate conspiracy plot lazy and derivative, and found Hardy's performance as unintentionally hilarious as opposed to energetic, if not a little bizarre. The Boston Globe's Ty Burr wrote, quote, "Venom, the movie, is a reptilian Marvel mishmash whose touch saps the life force of almost everyone in it," end quote. Meanwhile, Richard Roper at the Chicago Sun-Times wrote that, quote, "Tom Hardy is one of the best actors in the world, but as he flounders his way through Venom, we're reminded even the finest talents can sink under the weight of a terrible movie," end quote. A lot of reviews basically question why an actor as great as Tom Hardy would do the role. The answer is twofold. One, money, and two, it seems like a blast. And audiences certainly thought so, considering they ran up the box office total well past $850 million. Audiences were willing to embrace the movie on its own terms, finding entertainment in the peculiarities and the dynamic between Brock and the symbiote. It validated Sony's Spider-Man universe strategy and led to 2 direct sequels as well as Morbius and Madam Web. Alas, the audience and critics were more in line on those movies. Both disdained them outside of meme purposes. Still, at least Venom was pretty fun. 1991's Hook is, by a decent margin, Steven Spielberg's worst reviewed film. By this point, he'd been in the game for a couple of decades and was on the cusp of some of his most critically and commercially successful films. Hook was the latter, but not the former. It was a continuation of the Peter Pan story that starred Robin Williams, Julia Roberts, Bob Hoskins, and Dustin Hoffman. Peter Pan had become Peter Banning, a high-powered lawyer who's having trouble at home because he's always working. He's forgotten his youth, including Neverland, until his kids are abducted by Captain Hook and he needs to save them. The movie was a personal one for Spielberg. Peter has a troubled relationship with his son, Jack, which echoed Spielberg's issues with his own father. And like Peter, Spielberg had found huge success that took him away from his family. Of it, Spielberg said, quote, "I have even experienced it myself when I have been on a very tough shoot and I've not seen my kids except on weekends. They ask for my time and I can't give it to them because I'm working," end quote. Filming started in 1991 and made extensive use of practical sets. The budget ballooned from $48 million to $70 million because they went 40 days over schedule. The movie dealt with eternally relevant themes: aging, lost innocence, and the tensions between the responsibilities of an adult to those around them and to their own selves. Critics were pretty severe in their judgment of the film. They thought that it was bloated and too long, and that it lacked the magic and wonder of its source. They thought that the sets looked too artificial and staged, and thought that Robin Williams' performance was tonally inconsistent, if not miscast for the role. Of it, Roger Ebert wrote, quote, "Poignancy, lessons to be learned, speeches to be made, lost marbles to be rediscovered, tears to be shed. The conclusion of Hook would be embarrassingly excessive even for a movie in which something of substance had gone before," end quote. He would say that Spielberg would have done better to just do a straight adaptation instead of doing his own spin. Not even Spielberg apparently liked the movie. Of it, he said, quote, "I want to see Hook again because I so don't like that movie, and I'm hoping someday I'll see it again and perhaps like some of it," end quote. According to him, he felt insecure the entire shoot, and the more insecure that he felt, the more money he poured into making it look as impressive as it does. Audiences felt very differently though. They loved the movie enough to drive it to more than $300 million at the box office. It's the most successful pirate-themed movie after the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, and John Williams' score got plenty of praise as well. Kids and families loved it, especially the elements that critics didn't enjoy, the spectacle and the elaborate production design. In the years since, it's even undergone something of a critical reevaluation as well. This is one of those cases where all's well that ends well. Aaron Horvath and Michael Jelenic were the directors behind one of 2023's highest-grossing films, the Super Mario Bros. Movie. After the 1993 film was a critical and commercial disaster that has, in fact, been reappraised in the years since, Nintendo was wary of licensing the character out for a film adaptation. Eventually, though, they were able to work with Illumination and Universal to bring it to the big screen. It, of course, raised the question, would this be a good adaptation? The film had a star-studded voice cast: Chris Pratt as Mario, Anya Taylor-Joy as Princess Peach, Charlie Day as Luigi, and Jack Black as Bowser. While Pratt voicing Mario might have caused some consternation, once the film actually came out, it was a hit unlike any other video game movie before it. If there was a record, this film smashed it, racking up $1.3 billion against a $100 million budget. It, more or less, ended up being what people wanted it to be. To be sure, it had to walk a fine line. Not only did it need to please longtime fans who might be obsessed with Mario, but it also needed to please casual fans and people that know of the games, but never really got into them. I think that it walked that line pretty well. It was a vibrant, colorful interpretation of the games that remained as faithful as it could be to the source, while crafting a narrative that anybody could get into. Critics ended up being fairly lukewarm about the film. They agreed that it was competently made, but criticized it for playing it safe and prioritizing the commercial appeal over artistic ambition. Some really didn't like it. Robbie Collin of The Telegraph wrote, quote, "Somehow this new animated adaptation of the video game is even worse than the abominable 1993 live action. Even the CGI is second rate," end quote. And Paul Attard, writing for Slant, wrote, quote, "The film feels like it's content to check off to-do notes and scratch the viewer's nostalgia itch," end quote. That's the issue that most critics complained about. It's a film that doesn't aspire to be more than it is, and is content with being nostalgia bait. I can appreciate that opinion, but I do digress, because it, I think, misses the context of the film. Nintendo already tried doing something completely different 3 decades prior. It fell flat critically and commercially, so, of course, they took the complete opposite tack this time. None of that mattered to audiences, of course, which in this case is a perfect mirror of the critic score on Rotten Tomatoes. It dominated the box office and was the second highest grossing film in 2023 after Barbie. The film validated the approach to the adaptation and all but ensured that we would get a sequel. It's a film that appeals to pretty much everyone. It was meant to be a straightforward, well-executed adaptation, not some kind of prestige reinvention of the source. On that count, it was a success beyond perhaps even Nintendo's wildest dreams. Tony Scott, the younger brother of the legendary Ridley Scott, was an excellent director. He directed several classics such as Top Gun, Days of Thunder, True Romance, Enemy of the State, and more. He was, in his own time, severely underappreciated. Manohla Dargis, writing for the New York Times, captured it clearly, calling him, quote, "one of the most influential film directors of the past 25 years, if also one of the most consistently and egregiously underloved by critics," end quote. His movies were action-packed, fast-paced, and beautiful to watch. They had a pure cinematic quality to them, the kind that you get from a master of the craft who works on a deep level. Translated another way, he's what critics, wrongly, would describe as someone who cared more about style than substance. And as Dargis wrote, quote, "These were, more than anything, films by someone who wanted to pull you in hard and never let you go," end quote. His 2004 film, Man on Fire, has a pretty wide disparity between the critics and audience score. The film reunited Scott with Denzel Washington, his muse, as an ex-CIA guy who needs to protect a young girl in Mexico City. When she gets kidnapped, he goes on a quest for vengeance. The film was visceral and carried Scott's stylized work, rapid editing, vibrant color grading, and kinetic camera work that immersed the audience in Washington's psychological state. Scott brought an action sensibility and visual style that he had honed over decades to bear on this film, turning what could have been a conventional revenge flick into something ambitious and emotionally complex. Man on Fire was dismissed by critics who thought that it was an exploitative revenge thriller that glorified violence and used style to cover up what they thought was a general lack of substance. They didn't go for the graphic torture and violence that they thought was morally questionable in its seeming celebration of brutal vengeance. They also just didn't like Tony Scott's style. They thought that it was over the top and distracting. A.O. Scott, writing for the New York Times, summed up what most of the negative reviews seemed to think. Talking about revenge in the service of helping a little girl, he wrote, quote, "This is a time-tested movie con, but rarely has been deployed so contemptibly. You can relish the sight of a lowlife's fingers being amputated one by one, his wounds cauterized by a dashboard cigarette lighter, without guilt because, after all, he was involved in harming a child. And if you object, then you're not only some kind of a wishy-washy due process wimp, but you also probably condone the kidnapping of little girls," end quote. I think that's a bit over the top. This is a movie after all, and most of the audience is probably smart enough to discern between real life and the film. The movie made $130 million on a budget of as high as $70 million, so after ancillary sales it probably made some money. But thanks to syndication, it found a substantial audience who responded both to Washington's performance and Scott's direction. The audience valued the film in a way that critics certainly did not. If there's one director that studied at the filmmaking school of Tony Scott, it's Michael Bay. The two have a similar style, favoring kinetic action, stylized visuals and violence, and fast-paced editing. They take you on roller coaster rides from beginning to end, which is part of the reason that I like their movies so much. A number of Michael Bay movies were disliked by critics but beloved by audiences, but the one with the biggest disparity between the critical and audience reception seems to be Bad Boys 2. The movie teamed up Bay again with Will Smith and Martin Lawrence, who played Miami detectives Mike Lowry and Marcus Burnett. It came 8 years after Bad Boys was a critical flop, but a commercial hit. The film basically doubled down on the action spectacle and the comedic rapport between the leads. Bay's sensibility of combining elaborate action set pieces with character-driven humor and rapid-fire banter was put to excellent use here. Did all of it propel the plot forward? Sort of. Was it awesome as hell? Of course. The movie has one of my favorite scenes in any movie ever, where the two leads end up wrecking a Klan meeting. It's funny as hell, and Bay, Lawrence, and Smith are somehow able to keep a pace the entire film. But if this movie doubled down on everything that I think made the first one so great, it also doubled down on everything that critics hated about the first one. Like literally, the first one has a 46% critical score on Rotten Tomatoes, and this one has a 23%. If that's not the universe having a sense of humor, I don't know what is. Critics thought that it was an excessive, vulgar action film designed purely for commercial appeal without artistic merit. That, I suppose, depends on what your idea of artistic is. Michael Bay is an auteur down to his bones. His films are uniquely his, and his vision is uncompromising. Some might not like that. They derided the reliance on explosions and vehicle destruction and said that it was style over substance. They took issue with the crude humor, violence, and thought it to be a perfect example of mindless blockbuster excess. It's basically the same critique that Bay has gotten his entire career, that he's an indulgent filmmaker who's wasting his talents on making movies like this. The critical establishment dismissed it as a guilty pleasure at best. J.R. Jones, writing for the Chicago Reader, encapsulated the wider critical opinion as such, quote, "This putrid action flick crawls around for 2.5 hours before expiring in a septic field of bad one-liners, half-hearted catchphrases, obliterated cars, vicious slow-motion bullet penetration, graphic corpse mutilations played for laughs, and shamefully hollow bonding scenes between its two dyspeptic megastars," end quote. Audiences, however, dug it. There's a 55-point difference between the audience and critics on this one, and it made $273 million on $130 million. It was followed by sequels in 2020 and 2024 respectively, both of which made more than $400 million and got solid reviews, far better than the first two. Frankly, Bay's box office has, at this point, more than validated his style of filmmaking. It might not be for everyone, but it's undeniable that it has a wide audience. And not only has it lasted for a few decades, the movies are doing better now than they were before. If Bad Boys 2 shows anything, it's that Bay has, for much of his career, just been critic-proof. Len Wiseman's 2003 film, Underworld, is an action horror set in a world where vampires and werewolves are engaged in ancient conflict. The film starred Kate Beckinsale as a vampire that hunts lichens and ends up falling in love with a human who gets bitten, forcing her to reconcile her feelings. The film had a distinct visual style that became iconic to the franchise and ended up being a surprising success. It made more than $95 million on a $22 million budget and wound up launching a franchise that's still going strong today. Critics admitted that yes, the film certainly had a distinct visual style, but as with so many other films, they thought that it ended up lacking substance. Certainly, the concept isn't anything new, so I can understand claims of it being derivative, though I've yet to consider that as a constructive form of criticism as opposed to simply being a descriptor. Beyond that, reviewers found fault with Beckinsale's performance, which they found emotionally lacking. They criticized the dialogue and found the style to be dark and murky, as opposed to being visually interesting. They figured it as an action flick with goth aesthetics and commercial appeal, but with little artistic merit. Of it, David Edelstein, writing for Slate, said, quote, 125 minutes is a long time to stare at a movie that's basically in bleached blue and white with occasional splotches of brick red. The palette reinforces the monotony of the storyline, end quote. Kevin Carr, writing for Film Threat, said, quote, there's too much pretension in this film. Lots of intense stares into the camera, lots of uncomfortably hip clothes, lots of pompous names for themselves, end quote. The disparity between what critics and audiences thought, though, was significant, nearly 50 points. The film found a substantial audience, and I distinctly remember it getting a lot of play on TV, usually on the Sci-Fi Channel or on Spike when it was still around. People dug the aesthetics certainly enough to keep it going for many more movies and a TV show that's now in the works. Wiseman did a decent job with world building and establishing a distinct visual style. I don't think the film's going to get a critical reevaluation anytime soon, but that's secondary to the fact that it's already found an audience. One recurring debate I see online is which movie has the best version of the devil, and invariably, one of the names that gets mentioned the most is Peter Stormare's Satan in 2005's Constantine. The movie was directed by Francis Lawrence and adapted the Hellblazer series. It starred Keanu Reeves as the titular occult detective and exorcist John Constantine. While I prefer Matt Ryan's version for the show, which was far too short-lived, Reeves was okay. I mean, he looked nothing like Constantine, but what can you do? The movie shifted from England in the comics to Los Angeles. The city was infused with demons, angels, and religious mythology, and while the film did deviate from the source in terms of character ethnicity, setting, and specific narrative details, it did maintain the spirit of the comic's supernatural noir sensibilities. One thing that the film did do pretty interestingly was its version of hell. Of it, Lawrence said, quote, and we started to look at the nuclear test films from the 1940s of the nuclear blasts and just decided that it would be great if the landscape was not only violent with these creatures, but also the atmosphere. So we decided that it was kind of an eternal nuclear blast, except nothing ever really gets obliterated because it's eternal and it's constantly going, end quote. Critics, however, thrashed it. They complained about the convoluted plot involving angels and demons and that the film took itself too seriously despite what they perceived to be inherent absurdity. It tried to balance gothic horror with action film spectacle, earning a criticism for being tonally inconsistent. Of it, Lawrence Topman at the Charlotte Observer wrote, quote, there's a potentially good story rattling around somewhere inside this broken, self-contradictory, and finally meaningless film, end quote. And another critic, Mark Holcomb, wrote, accurately enough frankly, that, quote, fans of Hellblazer are bound to be disappointed, end quote. As a fan of Hellblazer, it wasn't what I wanted, but I tried to view adaptations on their own merits and found that Constantine was entertaining enough. Audiences seem to enjoy it as well. There's a pretty wide disparity between audience and critical enjoyment here, but despite that, the movie still made more than $230 million on a budget of as high as $100 million. Over the years, it's been critically reappraised as well. Rafael Montemayor wrote an article for Rotten Tomatoes where he made the argument that we owe the movie an apology, that the movie offers a unique vision of hell, that it merges noir and comic book film aspects, and that it had an excellent cast on the whole. He makes pretty good points. The film was genuinely ambitious for its time. It got an R rating when most comic book movies were PG-13, and I'm looking forward to the sequel, which both Reeves and Lawrence seem to be on board for. 1999's The Boondock Saints, directed by Troy Duffy, is a favorite of mine. It's a vigilante action film that has some of the funniest moments I've ever seen on screen. The film stars Sean Patrick Flanery and Norman Reedus as the titular saints, as well as Willem Dafoe as an eccentric FBI agent, and David Del Rocco as one of the funniest characters in a film ever. At the center of it is the relationship between the two brothers who experience an epiphany and decide to rid Boston of its underground element. Predictably, this goes awry. The movie combined elements of a crime thriller, action, and dark comedy, featuring elaborate action choreography and a distinct visual style. Unlike many of the films on this list, this film was not successful in theaters. In fact, it was an utter bomb, making less than $45,000 on a $6 million budget, but it quickly achieved cult status that would cement it throughout the years. Boondock Saints, also unlike many of the other movies, also suffered from a lack of wide release. Part of the reason that its critical opinion is so low and that the disparity between its critical and audience reception is 65 points is because critics barely even saw it. Those who did, however, did not like what they saw. And the reviews sort of echo the kind of issues critics had with Man on Fire half a decade later. It was too violent, the violence had no meaningful consequences, and the characters were thinly written. That I disagree with. This is a movie with several unique characters with distinct personalities. Sure, those personalities are derived from their eccentricities, but they make them memorable characters. Critics would call it a cheap ripoff of Tarantino films, trying hard to be cool and edgy, but not being able to back it up. Nathan Rabin, writing for the AV Club, wrote, quote, "Satire or self-parody would be vastly preferable to the film's unironic endorsement of outlaw justice, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anything resembling irony or subversiveness in this exercise in lovingly rendered ultraviolence," end quote. Here, I think that Rabin isn't meeting the film on its terms. A satire with ironic violence might be preferable, but it's not the movie that Troy Duffy wanted to make. Movies are a static work of art. Once released, it is what it is. Critics then need to accept a movie for what it is and try to interrogate it on its level, not as what they would want it to be. Other critics basically have the same issue, too much violence and not enough meaning behind it. Robert Kohler, writing for Variety, said, quote, "More interested in finding fresh ways to stage execution scenes than in finding meaning behind the human urge for self-appointed righting of wrongs. Pick is stuffed with effects that have no lasting impact," end quote. Still, the movie has had a remarkable, enduring legacy. It made bank in home video sales and on TV, where it developed a cult following that's only grown in the intervening decades. The chemistry between the leads and supporting cast is undeniable, and I hope a third one eventually gets made. I enjoy reading critical reviews more than most, I think. A good chunk of them are well written, even if I end up disagreeing with the critic on matters of taste. But I think that's part of the reason that criticism is so enduring and enjoyable. The difference of opinion isn't just part of the point, it's the whole point. After all, art should be divisive. If it isn't, it risks being boring, and a boring film is worse than a bad film.